Welcome to a special edition mini-series of Cynical Celluloid, where we're going to take a look at the legacy of one of the most iconic horror films of all time, The Exorcist. Specifically, we're looking at the sequels of The Exorcist, that's Exorcist 2 and 3, and the lesser-known spin-off of sorts, The Ninth Configuration. While I know it means missing out on a few chapters, primarily the hugely botched prequel that was so bad that they filmed it twice, well, that's almost literally true, I'll touch upon them in no great detail. Why not start at the original Exorcist? Well, frankly, it's been covered so heavily over so many years that I likely have very little new to bring to the discussion, though I will be using it to put things in context along the way. Suffice to say, the original film is one with a well-deserved reputation, and I respect it highly. With the huge response the original had, and understandably feeling it stood well enough in and of itself, Blatty and Friedkin, writer and director respectively, felt no massive drive to make a sequel. Warner Brothers, however, seeing The Omen restoking the public fascination in spiritual battles on the big screen, decided it was time to make a sequel. The result was received poorly, and despite making its money back and then some, The Exorcist 2 was a critical flop, hugely so. And there was even an event including studio heads who were involved with the making of the film being chased from a theatre. At least according to Friedkin, who had nothing but disdain for any of the sequels. Was it really that bad? Well, critic Mark Kermode thought so, and he was one of the people you would think would try to like the film. The Exorcist 2 is a strange movie and a bit of a mess when it comes to the writing, but the problems didn't begin or end there. Borman was apparently approached for directing the original, though apparently he didn't care for the script, finding it too dark and downbeat. Considering some of the dropped ideas from this film, I do kind of wonder about his recollections, considering he directed Zardoz instead. However, Borman wound up in the director's chair for Exorcist 2, and considering he didn't care for the first film, even talking about not wanting to torture a child for this movie, which is something at odds with a couple of scenes that were cut down in the final film, he took it and made it his own. The Exorcist 2 is a strange feeling movie. Re-evaluation of the film has found an audience, though while I find the film oddly intriguing, I can't jump fully on board. Why not? Well, let's take a look at the movie. Buckle up, it's synopsis time. Father Philip Lamont suffers a terrible result from an exorcism gone wrong while in Africa. A young girl, said to be a healer, is set alight during the exorcism and dies. Returning home to the US, Lamont is quickly put in place to investigate the death of his friend Father Merrin, with an eye to debunking his writings that are seen by the church as archaic and heretical. Meanwhile, Reagan, a now 17-year-old and still recovering young woman, is helping at the institute that's treating her for the effects of her ordeal. Reagan seems on the surface to be fully recovered, but she's hiding memories, or at the very least not acknowledging them to others, even the caring Dr. Tuskin. Attending a cutting-edge hypnotic therapy session, Lamont saves the doctor from a near-fatal problem that sends her heart into fibrillation by going into the hypnotic session where he encounters Reagan's demon. Not remembering anything, Dr. Tuskin dismisses it, but a freak fire, seemingly foretold by Reagan in a drawing, begins to turn the attentions of Tuskin as she and Lamont realise that something still dwells within her and that she's trying to deal with it herself. The next morning, Reagan suffers a terrible nightmare of Africa and locusts, where a young boy leads a struggle against a swarm, while she nearly ends up sleepwalking off the top floor balcony. During a second hypnotism session, Lamont sees a vision of Merrin's work in Africa, where he comes face to face with the demon Pazuzu, revealed to be in the body of a healing boy, Kokumo. Lamont heads to Africa in defiance of the church to find the now adult Kokumo, while Reagan manages to prompt a young mute girl to talk. She's a healer, something that scares Dr. Tuskin and affirms Merrin's and Lamont's belief in a future of psychic healers. His investigation in Africa eventually leads him, via a psychic chat with Reagan and a strange hallucination, to the now adult Kokumo, where he learns of why the locusts swarm and how there are some locusts that resist that. Back in the US, Reagan heads to Georgetown to the old home, and having stolen the synchronizer, Reagan and Lamont link while Tuskin and Sharon go in chase. On their arrival, locusts attack both the doctor in the car and Lamont in the house, and as the passengers in the car fight to get out of the wreck, Sharon seems to turn. Regan enters the room where years ago she suffered, and Lamont is seduced by Pazuzu's Regan, sat on the bed, tempting him, while pushing him to kill the good Regan. Sharon burns herself in the spilled petrol of the car crash while Lamont struggles with the evil Regan, and as the house tears itself apart, he rips out the heart of the demon. And this leaves Regan to channel Kokumo's locust spelling moves, as calm falls upon the world again, and Lamont, Tuskin and Regan reunite while Sharon dies in Tuskin's arms, and Lamont gives her the last rites. All is calm, despite the kerfuffle of onlookers, as the synchronizer flashes in Tuskin's face. Well, if the synopsis sounds a bit fragmented, then there's a good reason for that. The Exorcist 2 is a very odd-feeling, often disjointed movie. It carries the feel of a fitful near-nightmare. Not even the full-on nightmare, the kind of restless dream that's botheringly uncanny. And it feels like it's teetering on the edge of being something really disturbing, but it doesn't quite go over that edge. It keeps you hanging, just tantalisingly close to letting loose. It's more a simmer than a full-on boil. It's quite an odd experience when watching a film that doesn't quite nail down what it's about. It's not fresh news that Boorman didn't care much for the original film. He apparently found it appalling. He felt it was about torturing a child, so turned it down. So when he was approached to do a sequel, he did what he wanted to do with it. Contrary to some opinions, he didn't find a studio clamouring for interference. The original had done so well and gained such a reputation that the studio pre-sold the sequel to such success that they had pretty much left him to his own devices. They'd already made their money, they didn't need to get involved. Initial audiences didn't know how to react to what was presented to them. In one recollection, Friedkin tells of a studio executive relating how they'd been chased out of a theatre screening during a preview, and how one angry audience member, when he realised they were there, said, quote, "The people who made this piece of shit are in this room." And they were then chased out of the theatre and down the road by some pissed off moviegoers. The reactions didn't get much better from there. The Heretic was met with withering and almost universal critical ire, Pauline Kael being one of the most notable dissenters from the popular opinion of the movie, at least for the most part. The film then stalled any further sequels for quite some time, though a spin-off film, The Ninth Configuration, did get released about 3 years later. It wasn't really as if most would recognise it as being part of the Exorcist series that Blatty conceived of, though, so it wasn't really dented by the reputation that The Heretic put upon the name of The Exorcist. Oddly enough, I rather find myself more in Pauline Kael's camp on the film. The Exorcist 2, which I'll refer to going on as The Heretic, is one of the messiest films around on a few levels. The story is paced in a strange way. It flips and changes at the drop of a hat and dips in and out of hallucinatory sequence with utter abandon of the audience, and mostly feels like Boorman was on a plot progression that he forgot to bring the audience in on. It all feels so removed from a POV character's guidance that it comes over more like the more eccentric portions of the Bible being read via the telephone game by people who have had too much speed. It's absolutely potty. And it has some seemingly incredible degree of ADHD if you go by how many scenes there seem to be there that don't serve any purpose. Regan's tap dancing scenes being one of the prime examples there. Well, okay, they could be given purpose if it's to set up the character as having grown up into a beautiful young lady who's largely normal for her age and started flirting with boys. It seems a bit plonked into me, though. The thing is, though, that there is quite a bit of this kind of thing. Boorman's films don't always make sense on a naturalistic level, though. They're often coloured with almost Gillian-esque surrealism, and despite this being intended to be as mainstream a movie as a horror about possession can be, it does carry his flair for the oddity. This kind of clashes with the original, though, which, as supernatural as it gets, tended to keep its feet on the floor. What The Heretic feels like is more like an errant and later Omen film than it does an Exorcist movie. The Exorcist was released in 1973 and it was an astounding hit. The Omen cashed in on the interest with its release just 3 years later, and Warner Brothers rushed forward to get back on the train after unsuccessfully courting both Friedkin and Blatty to make a sequel, which was something that neither wanted to do at that point. Long story short, it was a bit of a scramble to get it out there. Borman, for his part, had to deal with not having Blatty. Probably not a problem for him considering his opinion with the original script. But he also had to deal most importantly without Ellen Burstyn and very nearly without Linda Blair. Linda Blair said she liked the eventual proposed script for The Heretic, having rejected a few before. But things changed significantly once she was contracted and would continue to do so throughout the shoot. There were things that both stars Richard Burton and Linda Blair had problems with, including a scene where evil Reagan seduces Lamont into a childhood bed, where the events of the first film took place. And there were other slightly troubling things, like the definite sexualisation of 17-year-old Reagan in this film, which thankfully was dialed back a bit. Burton clearly didn't think that much of the film to begin with, and apparently he said he did it to finance his divorce at the time. While it's not regarded as a troubled movie production in particular, with hindsight, it does look as if it had some signs that things would be difficult. The writing of The Heretic takes a very different tack to the supernatural. While some of the things from the original Exorcist remain, namely a struggle between science and faith, it's presented with a more, what I can only describe as, wooey bent. The Exorcist lent heavily on the medical and psychological fields. There's a reason why many people found Reagan's medical examination to be the most disturbing aspect of the film, and the resort into exorcism is set up as being a desperate last-ditch effort. The journey becomes a medical mystery to exploring the nature of faith. Karras himself tries to exhaust all the medical routes before he pursues the spiritual, and this aside, the film is about his journey towards faith as he's forced to recognise the face of a tangible evil and confront it. This battle costs him his life, and that was incidentally what Borman took to mean that evil had won. I solidly believe that the opposite of that happened. This leads us up to the elephant in the room, the synchronizer machine. This one prop gets held up as likely the most ridiculous thing in the film, and yeah, it's kinda silly, but that should not be what breaks this film for you. The funny thing is that thinking about this device is what made me realise that The Heretic doesn't actually belong in the horror genre so much. It more belongs in the science fiction genre, or pseudo-science fiction at least. Lamont even raves about the effectiveness of the device, calling it miraculous. The pseudoscience of the film is really not all that, though. It's a fairly daft device to forward the story, but it does its job. But I think too much attention is given to the rather hokey prop, rather than what it does. Later into the film it becomes less important anyway, as the telepathy just seems to happen without it, all explained by Reagan in some exposition, and there's a lot of that in this film. The thing is that the synchronizer machine is simply the gaudily coloured tip of the iceberg when it comes to clunky writing in The Heretic. It's a bumpy journey though, a lot of ideas all accompanied by little diversions, and while a lion's share of it does eventually link up, however loosely, it all feels a bit disparate and a bit vaporous, like very different things from other scripts dropped in, maybe from earlier drafts, and it results in the film feeling like a patchwork. The Kokumo thread in one plot for one feels like it's from a very different film. It's not bad, but it feels like it doesn't quite fit. Then there's this adventure that Lamont takes that goes through a rather trippy psychological is this reality or is it delusion thing, and it's all so damn strange as it lurches through the motions. Don't get me wrong, it's quite fascinating, but it's also very disorientating while being at odds with the more grounded parts of the story. And that strikes on the most damaging thing about the film's direction. It's deeply unsteady and uneven. Borman as a director has a wonderfully unique style. There's a dreamlike feel to the editing, and the visuals often makes it less realist and pushes it towards being a fantasy. And in some of the scenes in The Heretic, it's way more pronounced than in others. Sometimes it works really well, like in Kokumo scenes, which are vibrant and heavily stylised. Other times not so well, as in the scenes where Lamont sees Merrin and Reagan while trying to help Dr. Tuskin. These two scenes, though they both deal with weird stuff, kinda highlight some of the problems rather well. The Kokumo scenes feel like they've had far more weight at some point. It's almost like the film was going to be a lot more about him, and it got reduced to more expository elements, while the scenes with Reagan were written as a much more grounded story that reflected the original Exorcist more, and then were adjusted to explore those weirder woo aspects to stitch it together with the Kokomo stuff. Regardless of if this is the case or not, it really doesn't matter. What does matter is that I'm forced to ask these things. The story is a bit of a mess. The fact that the minor character of Sharon is back and running apologies for the continued absence of Reagan's mother really does put the cherry on the cake as she pops up, gives an explanation and goes away until another plot hole needs filling, including why she came back to look after Reagan in her own mother's absence due to not wanting to be in this movie. You remember Sharon, right? She was one of the house staff from The Exorcist. Recasting is a thing, just saying. In fact, Dr. Tuskin is played by Louise Fletcher, and apparently Louise Fletcher was going to be cast as Chris McNeil because she kinda looks like Ellen Burstyn. The Doctor was going to be a different actor, but they rewrote it to be as it is. Presumably because it felt wrong to recast the McNeil role, but wow, is it awkward. So yeah, the writing is horribly mangled. It's like there were 2 or more very different screenplays that got smashed together, and it seems like it was constantly rewritten on the fly to try to fix other problems in production. And it's this, I think, that causes the film's direction to be stretched to breaking. Boorman seemed to have wanted a lot more in the film, with the work cut said to have been about some 3 hours long, which may actually have helped. But then again, it may really have dragged things down. However, I do enjoy the film, at least to a reasonable extent. While it's a certainly confused and confusing film, Boorman does capture a feeling of this all being a hazily recorded nightmare. There's an anxiety and disorientation about everything that goes on. It makes just enough sense to work in that dreamlike way, where the strangest things can happen and somehow be acceptable. But it does ask a lot of the audience to suspend their disbelief to the degree that you do have to do when you're having one of those kinds of dream. Being tagged as an Exorcist movie carries an expectation from the audience, especially directly following such an iconic film, and The Heretic only really uses the first film as a prelude to its own story, as a point of reference. It's almost as severe a change in tack as Halloween 3 was to Halloween 1 and 2. The thematic elements of the original are just not here. The closest it gets to a spiritual battle, to anything other than a superficial level, is the idea of evil being drawn to good. Beyond this, it's basically a somewhat psychological sci-fi and not so much a horror. Boorman himself described it as a metaphysical thriller. I honestly think that had this not been an Exorcist movie, it may have fared a bit better. Not much better, but not having the baggage of expectations that come from the first film may have given it a bit more wiggle room with an audience. Critic Mark Kermode said, Exorcist 2 is demonstrably the worst film ever made. It took the greatest film ever made and trashed it in a way that was on one level farcically stupid and on another level absolutely unforgivable. Everyone involved in this, apart from Linda Blair, should be ashamed for all eternity. Which I think is more him taking personal offence than being a professional critic. But it does highlight that the gulf between the fans of the original and The Heretic is based as much on expectations and personal desires than it is necessarily on the film itself. At least in context of this standalone quote. It happens, and it's certainly not invalid, but I personally think that Boorman's film did nothing to further or detract from Friedkin's movie. It just uses it as a jumping off point, and otherwise it has very little to do with or say about the first part. It feels much more like it's its own story with its own goals, and that's possibly the best way to approach this film. The studio wanted a sequel to go up against The Omen and make a ton of money, while Boorman, who didn't much care for the original, just wanted to do his own thing. And what was left at the end of it was something that no one asked for. One of the most major problems, other than being tagged as an Exorcist sequel, is that it feels like the film is cut down so heavily. The 2 main strands of the story don't feel very well integrated, and on top of that, there's the curiously casually explored blossoming of Reagan, which culminates in her going from flirting with a musician to nearly being raped by Lamont. There's the mishandled absence of Chris McNeil and her stand-in parent, which in itself feels abbreviated and like a half apology. The sum total of this is it just feels vaporous. It's like a fitful dream. And as such, it can feel just that little bit too elusive and nonsensical to spend much time with, especially if you're expecting a more coherent presentation like the first film offers. With that in mind, it's clear that this movie has and will turn a lot of people off. It nearly does me. But there's something about the dream logic world that comes out of this that, as little sense as it makes, feels oddly familiar. It's almost as if Boorman took a peek into one of my more wild dreams and committed it to celluloid. There is a final thought as to why the movie is so much like a bad dream. I suspect it's probably because it is. The final shot before the credits roll has the synchronizer sound and flashing on Tuskin's face, as the last image leaving us lets us wonder if this is all a fantasy. And that's The Exorcist 2, The Heretic. Not so much a film about faith as it is a biblically inclined story that mixes in a smattering of pseudoscience and spiritualism. This is the major thing that separates the original film from Boorman's work. The original Exorcist uses religious aspects as a vehicle to carry Karras through his journey, from hopelessness to purpose and conviction. And the shift to the more biblical slant The Heretic takes, it loses a lot of the character arc that made Blatty and Friedkin's classic so powerful. What we get in its place, though, to me, is just not as powerful. It's a ride that evokes biblical stories with things like the battle between good and evil, locust storms, near magical figures, healers no less, and so on. Even the style of the film comes over as being a recounting of a legend that's taken at face value. Even as an atheist, I can appreciate the grandeur of such story, though they don't touch me in the same way that a more relatable story of redemption and finding purpose can. Because as much as I don't buy into the Abrahamic stories, I can relate and be intrigued by the very human story that The Exorcist told. The Heretic, however, is not closely tied to a character arc. It's a lot of epic events with miraculous happenings. It's like a Bible story being told in modern times. And for me, that's where it loses a lot of the personal investment. It's not the film's oddities, not the eccentricities, and not the synchronizer, not even the pseudoscience. That said, despite its frivolity on a character level, it still makes for some entertaining if rather uneven watching. I think the film falls over mostly because there's so much not in the story. I could easily see this making a far better 3-hour movie, or even a mini-series where the gaps could be filled in. The film does feel that abbreviated. Like there's just so much missing, and I don't know if that's part of the difficult writing process, directorial choices, or even a lack of resources to make them happen. Whichever way this came down, it feels incomplete, but it's intriguingly stylish, seemingly enough so to garner a core of fans that defend the film. For me, it's a miss for the most part. It's fun, but it's flawed deeply enough to stop the film far short of greatness. But I'm glad it exists. The idea of evil being attracted to good is an interesting one, and the film does look great with the weird imagery and periodically genius filmmaking. Granted, it's often a mad kind of genius, but just look at the wonderful use of light in the opening scene, or the angelic visuals of Reagan on the balcony, and even the baffling madness of Kokumo scenes, which feel every bit as irrational as they are. A bad film for me is one that leaves me cold, one that offers me nothing back for my time watching it. And The Heretic is not that at all. Sure, it's kind of batshit crazy and its story may be a lot less fulfilling than The Exorcist for me, but it offers an experience that's quite uncanny. It's a film I feel more than relate to, and few films have captured that hazy dream experience quite like this one. And I think this is a lot of what Boorman brings to the filmmaking world, an odd, quirky vision that he clearly invests himself in 100%. Like it or loathe it, The Heretic is a very original take on a story that could have so easily been by the numbers, a cheap crowd pleaser that brought nothing new to the table. If it is a failure, it is at least one that failed on its own terms. I would rather see 1,000 failures like this than most of the soulless, cloned, demographically targeted, money-making successes that the studios tend to fart out for the most part. It may not be everyone's cup of tea, but I, for one, appreciate it for being the odd member of the family that it is. Overall, I can enjoy it if I take it for the dream logic story that it revels in. And I'm very aware that it's feeling like I was probably already going to stop on several occasions, and you're right, it's because the film produces so much ambivalence in me. There's a lot to criticise, way more than it should have, and there's plenty of things that are also there that you can admire and like. I find myself in a tug of war between team this is broken as fuck and team this is kinda trippy. On a positive note, Boorman has this outlandish style and approach that is bafflingly delightful and original, often beautiful. There are glimpses here and there of genius in the production design and the cinematography, one of these being this wonderful shot, and another one being the balcony scene, as misplaced as it is. But I can entirely understand why people take against it. It's very oddly put together with occasionally strange positioning of sequences, like Reagan's dream sequence / balcony scene, which is sandwiched awkwardly between the main trio making plans to use the synchronizer and the actual session. Then there's the failures in the writing, which haphazardly broaches a plethora of ideas that either go nowhere, are excusing casting issues, are at odds with the original Exorcist, or just comes over as another way to explain the inexplicable. Also, where the original only expects the audience to accept the existence of the supernatural for the sake of the story, The Heretic makes far deeper demands while trying to ground them. It just doesn't work very well on that front. Overall, it's a chaotic mess that stumbles to make its point, and it's a tall order to ask the majority of the audience to forsake the desire for coherence as you may in an actual dream. But for all the stumbling, there are some beautiful ideas and some wonderful filmmaking in there. You just have to wade through rather a lot to get to them. And while it's worth it for me, it isn't something that most will want to expend the effort for. Especially when ultimately the idea of goodness finally wins feels more something that comes by directorial dictate than it does by narrative conclusion. I enjoyed the ride. Your mileage, however, will vary. It's a definite mess, but for me, one I can enjoy. Bring a bucket full of charity and you may begin to love this troubled little sister of a legendary movie.